This second explosion is equivalent to almost 3 tons of TNT. The first event is a chemical reaction, but it's not the last chemical reaction to take the lives of sailors in Kursk.
When Dutch salvage crews raised the Kursk submarine from the Arctic seabed in 2001, they expected to find a tomb. What they discovered was far more haunting than anyone imagined. Handwritten notes scrawled in complete darkness, survival tools that became instruments of death, bodies positioned in ways that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Inside Russia's deadliest submarine disaster lay artifacts that revealed not just how 118 men died, but the desperate hours some of them survived. The notes they left behind would expose lies told by the Russian government. The equipment they tried to use would reveal the cruel irony of naval survival. And the physical evidence scattered throughout the wreckage would paint a picture of disaster so detailed, so haunting, that investigators are still processing what they found. This isn't just the story of a submarine that sank. This is the story of what happens when the ocean becomes a time capsule, preserving every moment of human terror and courage in perfect, horrifying detail. Because when you're trapped 355 feet underwater in a flooding steel coffin, every second becomes evidence, every decision becomes archaeology, and every final breath becomes a message that the sea refuses to let die. Picture this. You're standing on the deck of a Dutch salvage ship in the middle of the Barents Sea, watching massive pontoons slowly lift a 14,000-ton nuclear submarine from the ocean floor. It's 2001, more than a year after the Kursk disappeared beneath these same Arctic waters. The operation cost $65 million, took months of planning, involved some of the world's most advanced underwater technology, but nobody was prepared for what they found inside. The salvage itself was an engineering marvel that pushed the limits of what was possible underwater. Mammoet and Smit International, two Dutch companies with decades of experience in impossible recoveries, had to figure out how to raise a submarine longer than a football field from a depth where the water pressure could crush a human body in milliseconds. They used 26 cables, each capable of lifting 900 tons, connected to massive pontoons floating on the surface. The bow section was too mangled to recover. The explosions that sank the Kursk had essentially vaporized the front 40 feet of the submarine, leaving a twisted mess of metal buried 22 feet deep in clay sediment. So they made the decision to cut it away and leave it on the ocean floor, where it remains today. What they brought to the surface was the stern section, compartments 4 through 9, containing the reactor spaces, crew quarters, and the aft torpedo room where some of the crew had tried to survive. The first thing that struck the salvage teams was how intact the rear sections looked. From the outside, you could almost convince yourself that nothing catastrophic had happened. The hull was dented, scarred by its violent descent to the seabed, but structurally sound. The nuclear reactors had shut down automatically during the disaster, preventing the environmental catastrophe that everyone feared. There was no radiation leakage, no contamination of Arctic waters. But when the divers finally cut through the hull and entered the flooded compartments, they found themselves in what can only be described as an underwater tomb that had preserved every detail of the crew's final hours with surgical precision. The water temperature at that depth hovers just above freezing year-round. Combined with the lack of oxygen and light, it creates conditions that essentially freeze dry organic material. Bodies, clothing, paper, metal. Everything was preserved exactly as it had been on August 12, 2000, the day the submarine died. What made this salvage operation different from typical shipwreck recoveries was the level of forensic detail they were able to extract. Most sunken vessels become archaeological sites, where you piece together stories from fragments and speculation. The Kursk became something else entirely, a three-dimensional snapshot of disaster unfolding in real time, preserved with photographic clarity. The recovery teams found 115 bodies. Some were in their bunks, killed instantly by the explosion's shockwave. Others were found in positions that suggested they'd been thrown around the compartments like rag dolls when the torpedo detonated. But the most significant discoveries weren't the bodies themselves. They were the things the bodies were carrying: personal effects that told stories, documents that revealed timelines, equipment that showed exactly what the crew tried to do to save themselves, and most importantly, handwritten notes that would expose just how long some of these men had actually survived after their submarine hit the ocean floor. Because here's what nobody expected to find: evidence that 23 highly trained naval officers had lived for hours after the initial disaster, conscious and coherent enough to document everything that was happening to them. They'd written detailed accounts of their situation, made lists of who was alive and who was dead, even managed to record exact times as their situation deteriorated. These weren't random scribblings from men in shock. These were systematic reports from military professionals who understood that their observations might be the only way the world would ever know what really happened inside the Kursk. And what they documented would change everything people thought they knew about submarine disasters and survival. But the notes were just the beginning, because mixed in with the personal effects and official documents, the salvage team started finding evidence of things that should have saved lives, but instead ended them. Safety equipment that malfunctioned, emergency procedures that backfired, survival tools that became instruments of death in ways that submarine designers never imagined possible. Every artifact told part of a larger story about what happens when human engineering meets the ocean's absolute indifference to human life. And that story was about to get much more disturbing. When forensic investigators found Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov's body in compartment 9, he was still clutching something in his frozen fingers. At first they thought it might be identification papers, or maybe a photograph of his family. What they actually found were 2 handwritten notes that would become some of the most important documents in naval disaster history. These weren't death letters written by a man losing his mind in a crisis. These were military reports composed by a trained officer who understood that documentation might be the only way the truth about the Kursk disaster would ever surface. And what Kolesnikov documented in those final hours would expose the Russian government's lies about survivor timelines and rescue possibilities. The first note was written with a pen on a piece of paper, torn from an official naval logbook. Kolesnikov had dated and timed it precisely, 13:15 hours, which was exactly 1 hour and 44 minutes after the second explosion that sent the submarine to the ocean floor. Think about that for a moment. Nearly 2 hours after their world ended, this man was still alive, still thinking clearly, still functioning as a naval officer, documenting an emergency situation. The note read, "All personnel from Sections 6, 7, and 8 have moved to Section 9. There are 23 people here. We made this decision because of the accident. We feel bad, weakened by carbon dioxide from the air regeneration system. The pressure is increasing in the compartment. If we head to the surface, we won't survive the compression. We won't last more than a day." But that wasn't all. Tucked inside the official report was something much more personal, a private message to his wife Olga that simply said, "Olechka, I love you. Don't suffer too much. My regards to GV." The fact that Kolesnikov wrote 2 separate notes tells you everything you need to know about the kind of man he was. Even facing death, he separated his duty as a naval officer from his role as a husband, the official report for posterity, the love letter for his wife, both preserved by Arctic water that turned his final words into evidence. The second note was even more remarkable because of when and how it was written. Timed at 15:15 hours, 2 hours after the first note, it was scrawled in complete darkness. The emergency lighting had failed. The compartment was flooded with toxic air. Kolesnikov was writing by feel, using muscle memory to form letters he couldn't see. "It is dark here to write, but I'll try by feel. It seems like there are no chances, 10 to 20%. Let's hope that at least someone will read this. Here's the list of personnel from the other sections who are now in the 9th with me and who are going to try to get out. Regards to everybody, no need to despair. Kolesnikov." What followed was a list of names. 22 other men who were still alive 4 hours after the submarine sank. 4 hours. That's not a few minutes of confusion after an accident. That's enough time for multiple rescue attempts. Enough time for international help to arrive. Enough time to save lives if anyone had known these men were still breathing. But Kolesnikov wasn't the only one documenting the disaster. Lieutenant Commander Rashid Aryapov had also been writing, and his note provided crucial details about what actually caused the catastrophe. found wrapped in plastic torn from the pages of a detective novel, because even in a crisis, these men understood the importance of protecting written evidence from seawater. Aryapov's account described the initial explosion in technical terms that only a trained submarine officer could provide. The cause of the accident were faults in the torpedo compartment, namely, the explosion of a torpedo on which the Kursk had to carry out tests. Aryapov wrote, "The submarine was rocked violently, and there was a lot of debris flying, including the cover of the periscope column, trash, and so on." This wasn't speculation. This was eyewitness testimony from someone who survived the initial blast and understood exactly what had gone wrong. The notes proved that the disaster wasn't some mysterious external attack or collision with an American submarine, as Russian officials had suggested. It was a torpedo malfunction that these men watched happen in real time. But here's what makes these notes so much more than historical curiosities. They revealed that 23 highly trained naval professionals had survived the initial disaster, with enough presence of mind to analyze their situation, assess their options, and document everything systematically. These weren't panicked scribblings from men in shock. These were detailed reports that included technical assessments, personnel rosters, and timeline documentation. The handwriting analysis done by forensic experts revealed something even more chilling. The notes were written over a period of several hours, with handwriting that remained steady and legible, even as conditions deteriorated. That means these men stayed rational and coherent for most of their survival time. They understood their situation. They knew help should be coming. They expected rescue. And in those final hours, trapped in a flooding compartment 355 feet underwater, they maintained enough discipline and hope to keep detailed records of their ordeal, because they believed, right up until the end, that someone would eventually find these notes and learn the truth about what happened to the Kursk. The emotional weight of finding these documents cannot be overstated. When the notes were first made public in October 2000, they sparked international outrage because they proved that men had survived for hours after the submarine sank. Hours during which the Russian government was claiming there were no survivors and refusing international rescue assistance. But the notes also revealed something else that was about to make their survival story even more tragic. Because mixed in with Kolesnikov's careful documentation were references to emergency equipment that the crew was trying to use. Oxygen-generating cartridges that were supposed to extend their survival time by providing breathable air and absorbing toxic carbon dioxide. What the crew didn't know, what nobody could have predicted, was that their life-saving equipment was about to become their executioner in the most cruel and ironic way possible. Scattered throughout Compartment 9, investigators found dozens of small metal cylinders that looked like oversized soup cans. These were potassium superoxide cartridges, emergency air purification devices that every submarine crew trains to use in exactly the kind of situation the Kursk survivors faced. They're designed to absorb deadly carbon dioxide while simultaneously generating fresh oxygen through a chemical reaction that saved countless lives in submarine emergencies over the decades. But what happened in the Kursk's aft compartment wasn't salvation. It was one of the most cruel equipment failures in maritime history. The cartridges work through a simple chemical process. When activated, potassium superoxide reacts with carbon dioxide and water vapor in the air to produce oxygen. It's elegant, reliable technology that's been used in submarines for generations. Under normal emergency conditions, these devices can extend survival time by hours or even days, buying precious time for rescue operations. The Kursk survivors understood this technology. They'd been trained on it. When they found themselves trapped with rising CO2 levels that were slowly poisoning them, they did exactly what their training told them to do. They activated the emergency air purification system that was supposed to keep them alive until help arrived. What they couldn't have known was that their compartment wasn't just flooding with seawater. It was flooding with oily, contaminated water, mixed with diesel fuel, hydraulic fluid, and other chemicals from the submarine's damaged systems. And when potassium superoxide contacts oily water, it doesn't just produce oxygen, it ignites. The forensic evidence painted a picture of what happened next that's almost too horrible to comprehend. When the first cartridge was activated and came into contact with the contaminated floodwater, It triggered a chemical explosion that consumed oxygen rather than producing it. The reaction created temperatures hot enough to ignite everything flammable in the compartment, including clothing, paper, and human skin. Autopsies on the 23 survivors revealed that all of them suffered severe burns before they died of asphyxiation. Some had burns covering more than 60% of their bodies. Others showed evidence of trying to shield themselves from flames in a compartment where there was nowhere to hide. The burn patterns indicated that the fire spread rapidly through the confined space, creating an inferno that lasted several minutes before burning out. But here's the most devastating part. The fire consumed the oxygen they were trying to create. Instead of extending their survival time, the emergency equipment shortened it dramatically. Instead of clean, breathable air, they got toxic smoke and carbon monoxide. Instead of hope for rescue, they got fire and agony in their final moments. Think about the cruel irony of that situation. These men were following their training perfectly. They were using equipment specifically designed to save their lives in exactly this type of emergency. They did everything right according to decades of submarine survival doctrine, and their reward was death by fire in a flooding compartment 305 feet underwater. The chemical reaction that killed them wasn't some obscure technical failure that nobody could have predicted. Potassium superoxide's explosive reaction with oil-contaminated water was known to naval engineers, but the training protocols didn't account for the possibility that emergency cartridges might be activated in compartments flooded with contaminated water, rather than clean seawater. Investigators found evidence that the crew had tried multiple cartridges, probably thinking the first one was defective when it caught fire, instead of producing clean air. Each subsequent cartridge just added fuel to the inferno, consuming their refuge. Some of the survivors had plunged waist-deep into the rising floodwater, trying to escape the flames, only to face hypothermia and drowning as alternative methods of death. The physical evidence in Compartment 9 told the story of survival gone horribly wrong. Pieces of clothing were fused to metal surfaces by heat. Paper documents were charred but still readable, preserved by the rapid cooling effect of the floodwater that eventually extinguished the flames. Personal effects showed heat damage that indicated temperatures reached several hundred degrees in a space where men were struggling to stay alive. What makes this equipment failure so haunting is that it robbed the survivors of time they should have had. Submarine survival experts estimate that without the fire, the 23 men in Compartment 9 could have survived for 12 to 24 hours, breathing the available air and using manual CO2 scrubbers. That would have been enough time for international rescue teams to reach them, especially if Russian authorities had accepted foreign assistance immediately instead of waiting 5 days. Instead, the emergency air purification system that was supposed to buy them time became a death sentence that shortened their survival window to maybe 6 to 8 hours. The very technology designed to extend life in submarine disasters ended up ensuring that no rescue attempt could possibly have reached them in time. And here's the detail that haunts submarine safety experts to this day. There was no warning in the training manuals about this particular failure mode. No procedures for testing water contamination before activating oxygen cartridges. No alternative protocols for air purification in flooded compartments with chemical contamination. The Kursk survivors died because they followed their training in a situation their training hadn't anticipated. They used life-saving equipment in conditions where it became life-ending equipment, and they paid the price for a gap in submarine safety knowledge that nobody had identified until it was written in burns on their bodies and preserved in Arctic seawater for investigators to find a year later. But the equipment failure was just one part of the forensic story emerging from the wreckage, because the positions where bodies were found throughout the submarine revealed details about the disaster's violence that were even more disturbing than the equipment malfunctions. There's a phrase in forensic science: bodies don't lie. Human remains found at disaster sites become evidence that can reconstruct exactly what happened, when it happened, and how much time victims had to react. In the Kursk, the positions and conditions of 115 bodies created a forensic map of catastrophe that revealed the explosion sequence with scientific precision. In Compartment 2, near the torpedo room where the disaster began, investigators found something that defied belief: the body of a sailor, His name was never released to protect his family's privacy, was embedded in the ceiling, not thrown against it, not crushed against it, embedded in it, with the metal showing compression patterns that indicated impact forces exceeding 50 times the force of gravity. To understand how extraordinary this is, consider that fighter pilots begin experiencing blackouts at around 9 Gs of force. Crash test dummies are designed to measure impacts up to 20 Gs. This sailor had been accelerated to velocities that launched him like a human projectile, with enough force to embed his body in a steel ceiling, designed to withstand water pressure at depths of over 1,000 feet. The forensic analysis revealed that the primary explosion, when 2 to 3 tons of TNT equivalent detonated inside the torpedo compartment, created a pressure wave that moved through the submarine faster than the human nervous system could register. Men in the forward compartments didn't have time to react, brace for impact, or even begin to comprehend what was happening. The blast wave hit them with the force of a freight train moving at hundreds of miles per hour. In the reactor control room, 2 operators were found at their stations with skeletal injuries that indicated they'd been killed instantly by the shock wave. Their bodies showed compression fractures consistent with sudden deceleration, forces that crushed internal organs before their brains could process pain signals. Death had been instantaneous and, from a medical perspective, probably painless, though the violence of it was captured in bone fractures that told a story of forces no human body was designed to survive. But the most scientifically valuable discoveries were in the middle compartments, where the blast effects were strong enough to kill but not so overwhelming that they destroyed all evidence of the crew's final actions. Here, investigators found bodies positioned in ways that revealed exactly how the disaster unfolded second by second. Some sailors were found still holding tools, their hands frozen in positions that showed they'd been performing routine maintenance when the explosion occurred. Others were discovered in their bunks, apparently killed while sleeping during off-duty periods. The positions indicated that most of the crew had no warning whatsoever that anything was wrong. But in compartments 6, 7, and 8, the sections that Lieutenant Kolesnikov's notes indicated had been evacuated. Investigators found evidence of organized movement. Bodies near hatches suggested that some crew members had attempted to reach safer areas. Personal effects scattered in trails between compartments showed paths of evacuation toward the stern. This forensic evidence corroborated Kolesnikov's written account that survivors from multiple compartments had gathered in Section 9. It also revealed something that naval safety experts found remarkable, even in the chaos following catastrophic explosions. Submarine crews had maintained enough discipline and training to attempt organized evacuation procedures. The 23 bodies found in Compartment 9 told a different story entirely. These men had survived the initial blast, made it to what they thought was a safer location, and then faced a prolonged ordeal that the forensic evidence documented with brutal clarity. Every one of the 23 showed evidence of burns, but the burn patterns revealed that the fire hadn't killed them all immediately. Some had burns primarily on exposed skin, faces, hands, arms, suggesting they'd tried to shield themselves. Others had more extensive burns indicating they'd been closer to the ignition source or unable to protect themselves as effectively, but the positioning of the bodies revealed the most disturbing details. Several were found in the deepest part of the compartment, submerged in floodwater up to their chests. The evidence suggested they'd tried to escape the fire by partially immersing themselves in the rising seawater, choosing the risk of hypothermia, and drowning over the certainty of burning alive. Others were discovered pressed against the bulkheads, the walls of the compartment, as far from the center as they could get. Their positions indicated they'd been conscious and mobile during the fire, trying desperately to find refuge, in a space where there was no refuge to be found. The forensic pathology reports revealed that some of the men had lived long enough after the fire to inhale significant amounts of toxic smoke. Their lungs showed damage consistent with breathing superheated air and chemical fumes. Others appeared to have died from carbon monoxide poisoning as the fire consumed available oxygen and filled the compartment with deadly gases. But perhaps the most haunting discovery was evidence that some of the survivors had lived for minutes or even hours after the fire ended. Autopsy reports indicated that not all of them died immediately from burns or smoke inhalation. Some succumbed to hypothermia, as the Arctic water continued rising in their damaged compartment. Others died from what medical examiners classified as environmental exposure, essentially the combined effects of cold, toxic air, and physical trauma. In an environment where human survival was impossible, the water temperature at the bottom of the Barents Sea hovers around 32 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Without protective equipment, immersion in water that cold can cause death within 30 minutes. But the partially flooded Compartment 9 created conditions where the survivors were slowly freezing while breathing increasingly toxic air while suffering from severe burns. It's a combination of lethal factors that created one of the most prolonged and agonizing death scenarios in maritime disaster history. And every detail was preserved in the positions, injuries, and tissue conditions of bodies that became forensic evidence, documenting exactly what happens when submarine safety systems fail catastrophically. But the human remains were just part of the evidentiary picture. Mixed in with the bodies, investigators found technical debris that would finally answer the question of what actually caused the Kursk to explode and sink. Among the twisted metal and debris scattered throughout the forward compartments, investigators found pieces of evidence that solved the mystery of what actually destroyed the Kursk. But what they discovered wasn't just the cause of the disaster. It was proof of systematic failures that turned a preventable accident into a national tragedy. The largest single piece of evidence was a section of torpedo tube weighing over 1 ton, blown clear of its mounting and heat damaged beyond recognition. Metallurgical analysis revealed that the explosion had originated inside the tube itself, not from any external impact or collision. The blast patterns showed classic signs of high-test peroxide fuel ignition, the same chemical reaction that had powered German submarines during World War II and had been known to be dangerously unstable for decades. But the torpedo tube fragment was just the beginning. Scattered around it, investigators found pieces of the actual torpedo that had malfunctioned, a Type 65 kit torpedo from a manufacturing batch produced in 1990. These weren't random pieces of military hardware. They were specific evidence of a weapons system that Russian naval authorities knew had problems, but continued to use anyway. The torpedo fragments showed clear signs of weld failure in the fuel compartment. High-test peroxide, the propellant used in these older torpedoes, is incredibly corrosive and requires perfect sealing to prevent leaks. When it comes into contact with copper or other metals commonly used in submarine construction, it ignites explosively. The forensic analysis revealed that the torpedo's fuel had been leaking for an unknown period before it finally reached critical mass and detonated. What made this evidence particularly damning was that high-test peroxide torpedo problems weren't some unknown technical issue. The Soviet Navy had experienced similar accidents before. Naval engineers understood the risks. Safety protocols existed to test these weapons before use. But somewhere in the chain of command, those protocols had been ignored or inadequately followed. Mixed in with the torpedo debris, investigators found something that would become the most controversial piece of evidence in the entire investigation: a partially burned submarine operations manual. Not just any manual. Specifically, the procedures for handling and testing high-test peroxide torpedoes. But it was the wrong manual for the wrong type of torpedo, and it was missing critical safety steps that might have prevented the disaster. The manual found in the wreckage was meant for a different class of torpedo entirely. It provided general handling guidelines, but omitted specific valve testing procedures required for the Type 65 weapons actually loaded on the Kursk. Essentially, the submarine crew was following safety protocols that didn't match the equipment they were using. This wasn't a simple mistake or oversight. It was evidence of systematic problems in Russian naval operations that went far beyond one submarine or one crew. The wrong manual suggested problems with training, equipment standardization, and safety oversight that had been building for years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the technical evidence revealed even more disturbing details. Investigators found pieces of a high-pressure air cylinder that had been used to analyze blast dynamics. The cylinder showed damage patterns consistent with multiple explosions occurring in sequence. First, the initial torpedo fuel ignition, then secondary detonations as other warheads cooked off in the heat. The forensic reconstruction revealed that the disaster had unfolded in stages over approximately 2 minutes. The initial leak and ignition had created a fire hot enough to detonate up to 7 other warheads stored in the torpedo compartment. Each subsequent explosion had amplified the destruction, turning what might have been a containable torpedo fire into a catastrophic blast that destroyed the entire forward section of the submarine. Analysis of the sonar dome fragments, pieces of the submarine's acoustic detection equipment, showed heat damage indicating temperatures exceeded 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit in the torpedo compartment. That's hot enough to melt steel, which explains why the bow section was too damaged to salvage and why so many bodies in the forward compartments were essentially vaporized by the blast. The debris pattern also revealed crucial information about the submarine's final moments. Heavy pieces of equipment found scattered around compartments 3 and 4 showed that the explosion's force had been sufficient to tear apart machinery, weighing several tons, and throw it around like toys. The damage patterns indicated that the submarine had been literally torn apart from the inside out. But perhaps the most significant technical discovery wasn't what investigators found. It was what they didn't find. There was no evidence whatsoever of external damage to the submarine's hull. No impact marks from collisions with other vessels. No penetration holes from weapons fired by foreign submarines. No signs of sabotage or external attack. This evidence completely debunked the conspiracy theories that Russian officials had promoted to deflect blame from their own naval operations. Claims about collisions with American submarines or attacks by foreign vessels were simply not supported by the physical evidence. The Kursk had been destroyed by its own weapons, operated by its own crew, following procedures provided by its own naval command. The technical analysis also revealed something that made the tragedy even more preventable in retrospect. The Type 65 torpedoes loaded on the Kursk were known to be problematic. The 1990 manufacturing batch had been linked to previous incidents involving fuel leaks and handling difficulties. Some naval units had already stopped using these particular weapons because of safety concerns. But somehow the Kursk had been loaded with these dangerous torpedoes for what was supposed to be a routine training exercise. Either the safety information hadn't been communicated to the submarine's crew, or the warnings had been ignored in favor of using available weapons regardless of their condition. The wrong manual, the known defective torpedoes, the missing safety procedures. Every piece of technical evidence pointed to preventable human error rather than unavoidable mechanical failure. The men who died on the Kursk hadn't been killed by enemy action or unforeseeable technical problems. They'd been killed by institutional failures that put dangerous equipment in their hands without proper procedures to safely use it. And all of this evidence had been sitting on the ocean floor for more than a year, preserved in perfect detail by Arctic water that turned a submarine disaster into a 3-dimensional crime scene. The Kursk submarine disaster transformed from a military accident into a forensic time capsule that revealed truths the Russian government never wanted exposed. Every artifact recovered from the wreckage, from love letters written in darkness to oxygen cartridges that became instruments of death, to technical manuals that documented institutional failures, painted a picture of tragedy that was far more complex and damning than official reports had suggested. What made the Kursk's wreckage so scientifically valuable wasn't just the preservation of physical evidence. It was the way the Arctic Ocean had essentially frozen the disaster in time, creating conditions where investigators could reconstruct not just what happened, but exactly when it happened, how long people survived, and what they tried to do to save themselves. The handwritten notes alone changed the entire narrative of the disaster. Instead of a sudden catastrophic event with no survivors, the evidence showed that nearly 24 highly trained naval officers had survived for hours, documenting their situation and expecting rescue that never came quickly enough. Their final words revealed not just personal courage, but systematic problems with emergency response that cost lives unnecessarily. The forensic analysis of survival equipment failures exposed dangerous gaps in submarine safety protocols that had never been identified or addressed. The discovery that life-saving oxygen cartridges could become deadly weapons in contaminated water led to immediate changes in submarine emergency procedures for navies around the world. The Kursk's tragedy became a case study that potentially saved lives on other submarines facing similar emergencies. The technical debris provided conclusive evidence about the disaster's cause, finally putting to rest conspiracy theories about foreign attacks or mysterious external forces. The torpedo fragments, hull damage patterns, and blast analysis proved definitively that the Kursk had been destroyed by its own weapons, specifically by weapons that naval authorities knew were dangerous, but continued to use anyway. But perhaps the most significant discovery was what the combined evidence revealed about institutional failures in post-Soviet naval operations: the wrong manual, the defective torpedoes, the delayed rescue response, the initial denial of foreign assistance. Every aspect of the disaster pointed to systematic problems that went far beyond one submarine or one crew. The artifacts from the Kursk forced uncomfortable questions about military accountability, government transparency, and the human cost of political decisions. When the notes from survivors were finally made public, they sparked international outrage because they proved that men had died waiting for help that was available but not provided quickly enough. Today, pieces of the Kursk serve as memorials in multiple locations. The submarine sail, the tower that contained the periscope and communications equipment, stands outside a naval church in Murmansk, where families gather every August 12th to remember the 118 men who died. Smaller artifacts are displayed in naval museums, serving as reminders of both human courage and institutional failure. But 3 bodies were never recovered from the wreckage. They were likely vaporized by the initial explosion's violence, leaving no physical remains for families to bury or for forensic scientists to examine. Their absence serves as a reminder that even the most thorough investigation cannot always provide complete closure for disasters of this magnitude. The bow section remains on the ocean floor where it fell, too damaged and dangerous to raise. It's become an underwater gravesite that's officially protected from disturbance. But it also continues to hold secrets, pieces of evidence that might answer remaining questions about the disaster's precise sequence, or reveal additional details about the crew's final moments. The Kursk's wreckage proved that the ocean is more than just a graveyard for maritime disasters. In the right conditions, seawater becomes a preservative that can maintain evidence with museum-quality precision for years or even decades. The artifacts recovered from 355 feet below the Barents Sea were often in better condition than evidence found at land-based disaster sites. That preservation allowed investigators to reconstruct the Kursk disaster with a level of detail that's almost unprecedented in maritime accident investigation. Every aspect of the tragedy, from the initial torpedo malfunction to the equipment failures that killed survivors to the institutional decisions that delayed rescue, was documented in physical evidence that couldn't be disputed or dismissed. The investigation's findings led to concrete changes in submarine safety protocols, naval emergency procedures, and international cooperation agreements for maritime disasters. The Kursk sacrifice wasn't just a tragedy, it became a learning experience that potentially prevents similar losses in the future. But for the families who lost sons, husbands, and fathers on August 12, 2000, the forensic discoveries provided something more important than scientific knowledge. They provided truth about how their loved ones lived and died, proof that they'd shown courage under impossible circumstances, and evidence that their final thoughts had been preserved for the world to remember. The notes, the artifacts, the forensic evidence, all of it combined to ensure that the men who died on the Kursk would be remembered not as statistics in a military accident, but as individuals who faced disaster with dignity and left behind messages that the sea refused to let die.